Imani Carter was 33 years old when her new sister-in-law called her a loser in front of 200 wedding guests. The open bar had loosened Patrice's tongue, but not her aim. She said Imani was lucky to land a man with a real last name. She said teaching finger painting to 7-year-olds wasn't exactly a career. Vivian Ashworth watched from the head table and said nothing, which was its own kind of agreement. Julian squeezed his bride's hand under the tablecloth, but he didn't stand up. He didn't correct anyone. Imani just smiled, the way she always did when people decided what she was worth without asking. What none of them knew was that her maid of honor was already walking toward the microphone meant for a toast. And what Patrice didn't know was that the company she worked for had just been quietly purchased by a firm she'd never heard of. In 30 seconds, that would change. And nothing about this family's future would look the way they thought it did. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from today. And if stories like this speak to you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story is even more intense. The reception hall smelled like gardenias and warm candlelight. Every table wore white linen and gold centerpieces that caught the light and threw it back in soft, glittering pieces. The room held 200 people, their voices blending into a low, comfortable hum. Glasses clinked, heels clicked across the marble floor. A string quartet played something gentle near the far wall, the music floating up to the vaulted ceiling like smoke. Imani Carter, Imani Ashworth now, though the name still felt new in her mouth, sat at the head table and told herself this was the best day of her life. She almost believed it. She wore a gown the color of fresh cream, simple cut, no beading, no drama. Her natural hair was pinned up with tiny white flowers tucked into the coils. She looked beautiful, and she knew it. But she also knew she looked plain compared to the women at the tables closest to the front, the Ashworth family women, who wore their jewelry like armor and their smiles like weapons. Julian sat beside her, his hand warm over hers. He was handsome in the easy, effortless way that some men were born into. Sharp jaw, easy laugh, dark eyes that could make a room feel like it was just you and him. He squeezed her fingers when her knee bounced under the table. "Relax," he murmured, leaning close. "You look incredible." "I know," she said softly. She smiled at him. He smiled back. Then his mother stood up. Vivian Ashworth moved through a room the way old money always did, slow, deliberate, like the space owed her its attention. She was tall and thin, dressed in a steel blue gown that cost more than most people's car payments. Her silver hair was swept back without a single strand out of place. She held her champagne flute between two fingers like a prop she'd practiced with. The room quieted immediately. That happened around Vivian. Imani watched her stand and felt a small, familiar tightening in her chest. She'd felt it the first time Julian introduced them, over dinner at a restaurant where she hadn't recognized half the items on the menu. Vivian had looked at her the way people look at something that doesn't quite fit in a room. Polite, careful, assessing. She'd told herself it was nerves. Rich families were protective. It would pass. That was 8 months ago. It hadn't passed. From across the table, Patrice Ashworth Cole caught Imani's eye. Julian's older sister was 2 glasses of champagne past pleasant. Her lipstick was still perfect, but her gaze had that glassy, unfocused quality that meant the evening had shifted for her. She didn't smile. She just looked at Imani, then looked away. Julian, without seeming to notice he was doing it, glanced at his mother before he reached for his own glass. Imani noticed. She always noticed things like that. The memory came quickly, the way his memories always did. Uninvited, warm, and a little painful all at once. She was 24 years old, standing outside the business school auditorium in a rented cap and gown, diploma rolled under one arm. Grandpa Eli had both hands on her shoulders, his grip firm and steady. He was shorter than her by then. She'd grown, or maybe he'd shrunk a little with age, but he still felt like the biggest person she knew. "I'm proud of you," he'd said, "but I want you to hear something before all this gets loud." She'd waited. Eli never spoke without meaning it. "The day you let people see your worth in dollars instead of your character, that's the day you start attracting people who only want the dollars. You understand me?" She'd nodded, the Charlotte sun hot on the back of her neck. "Keep the important things quiet," he'd said, "until you know who you're dealing with." Vivian tapped her glass once, and the last few conversations in the room died. "I'd like to say a few words about my son," she began, her voice smooth and carrying. "Julian has always known his own mind." She smiled warmly at him. Julian smiled back. "We raised him to value the right things: tradition, name, legacy." She paused and let the words settle like fine china being placed very carefully on a table. "And today he chose to begin his next chapter." She turned her gaze toward Imani then. "We welcome Imani into our family." A small pause, just a half-second too long. "It takes a certain kind of woman to reach for something beyond what she was born into." A few people clapped. Imani kept her face still. Julian squeezed her hand again. She reached for something. That's what Vivian had said. Like Imani was a woman who had climbed in through a window. She didn't have time to sit with it, because Patrice was already standing up near the open bar. She hadn't walked up to make a toast. She hadn't asked for the microphone. She was just standing there, glass in hand, talking loudly to the two women beside her. Except the music had lulled in that precise moment, and the room was quiet enough that everyone heard every word. "I mean, let's be real," Patrice said, her voice carrying the particular carelessness of someone who didn't care who heard. "A school teacher, an art teacher." She laughed, a short, flat sound. "Julian always did have a soft spot for charity cases." She raised her glass. "Bit of a loser, don't you think?" The string quartet stopped. 200 people turned toward the bar. Imani stood frozen at the head table, a champagne flute in her hand, the golden light catching the tears she refused to let fall. The room stared at her, every single eye in the place, on her face. The silence was total. It had weight to it, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. 200 people holding still, holding their drinks, holding their judgment behind their eyes while they waited to see what Imani Carter, Imani Ashworth, would do. She didn't do anything. Not yet. She stood with her champagne flute raised halfway, like she'd been paused mid-motion, her face smooth and unreadable. The tears that had threatened a moment ago were gone. She'd sent them somewhere deep and quiet, the way she'd learned to do a long time ago. She was very good at that. Eli had taught her that too, without meaning to, simply by being a man who never let anyone see him break in public. Patrice was still standing near the bar. The two women beside her had gone still, their smiles fixed and awkward, the way people looked when they realized they'd been standing too close to something that had just caught fire. Then a chair moved. Dominique Reyes didn't ask for the microphone. She didn't need to ask. She simply walked toward the bandleader's stand with the calm, unhurried energy of someone who had already decided exactly what she was going to do and wasn't interested in being stopped. She was tall, warm brown-skinned, and dressed in a deep burgundy gown that fit her like she'd been poured into it. Her locks were pinned up at the back of her neck. Her chin was level. Her eyes were steady. She picked up the microphone the way you pick up something that belongs to you. "Excuse me," she said into it. Her voice was soft, but the speakers carried it clear to every corner of the room. "I'm Dominique Reyes, maid of honor. I had a speech prepared." She smiled once, brief and controlled. "I'm going to set it aside." A few people shifted. Someone coughed. Dominique turned slightly toward the back, where the venue's AV setup sat beside a projector screen that had been used earlier for a slideshow of Julian and Imani's photos. She nodded once to someone Imani couldn't see. The screen behind the head table lit up. It was a financial press clipping, large enough to read from the middle of the room. A headline from Capital Markets Weekly, dated 14 months ago. Hartwell Capital completes acquisition of Meridian Holdings Group. Anonymous founder holds controlling stake in $2.3 billion firm. Dominique let the room read it. She gave them 5 full seconds. Imani Carter, she said then, slowly and clearly, is the founder and majority owner of Hartwell Capital. Another pause. And Hartwell completed its acquisition of Meridian Holdings last spring. Her eyes moved, just briefly, across the room to where Patrice stood. Which, as some of you may know, is the parent company of Ashworth Cole Financial Group. The room erupted. Not loudly, not in the way of a crowd that had just heard good news. More like the sound a room makes when every person in it inhales at the same time and lets out a long, unsteady breath. Whispers moved table to table in waves. Heads turned. Glasses were set down. Someone near the back said a name, a journalist's name from the look of the sudden hushed urgency, and it passed between 3 or 4 mouths like a lit match. Imani stood still at the head table and watched. Patrice had gone the color of old paper. Her champagne flute was still in her hand, but her arm had dropped to her side like she'd forgotten it was there. She wasn't speaking. She wasn't smiling. Her mouth was slightly open, and she looked, for the first time since Imani had known her, like a woman with nothing to say. Vivian had not moved from her seat, but all the blood had left her face. Her expression was careful, controlled. She was a woman who knew how to wear a mask, but the mask had a crack in it now. Her eyes were doing calculations. Imani knew that look. She'd seen it in boardrooms. She turned to Julian. That was where she expected to find something she could hold on to. Pride, maybe. Or relief. Or even surprise. The genuine, uncomplicated kind. What she found instead was a look she would spend the next several hours trying to name. Julian was staring at her. Not at the screen, not at his mother, not at Patrice. At her. His dark eyes moved across her face slowly, the way you look at something when you're revising what you thought you knew about it. His jaw was set. There was something working behind his eyes. Not love, not shock. Something quieter and more deliberate. She filed it away. 3 minutes later, she watched Julian lean close to his mother's ear. They were standing just off the head table, close to the wall of windows that overlooked the garden. The room hummed and buzzed around them, guests reassembling into their gossip clusters, the string quartet starting up again uncertainly. Dominique had returned to her seat and placed one hand quietly over Imani's on the tablecloth. Imani didn't look at Dominique. She watched Julian and Vivian. Their voices were too low to hear, but Vivian's posture had shifted. The stiffness was gone, replaced by something leaning and urgent. Julian nodded once, then again. His hand was on his mother's arm, steadying her or being steadied by her. It was hard to tell which. The reception wound down in pieces after that. The cake was cut without ceremony. The dancing that followed was brief and uncomfortable, the energy in the room never quite recovering its shape. Guests said their goodbyes with an extra warmth toward Imani that hadn't been there 2 hours ago. Handshakes that lingered, eye contact that meant something different now. A few of Julian's relatives she'd barely met during the engagement suddenly found her fascinating. She smiled at all of them. She said thank you. She was gracious and warm and present. And she kept one eye, always, on her new husband's face. They left for the hotel suite just after 10. Julian held the car door open for her. He was quiet in the back seat, one hand resting on her knee, his gaze on the city light sliding past the window. The silence between them had a texture to it. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't hostile. It was careful. The wedding dress had 47 buttons down the back. Imani had counted them that morning while her hair was being done, running her fingers down the sample gown at the boutique 3 months ago, thinking about how long it would take to undo them all at the end of the night. She'd laughed about it then. It didn't feel funny now. She stood in front of the hotel mirror and worked through them one by one, her fingers moving slowly, her eyes on her own reflection. The suite was large and warm, cream walls and soft amber light, a room designed to feel like a beginning. A tray of champagne and strawberry sat untouched on the console table near the window. Behind her, Julian paced. He wasn't saying anything, just moving, from the window to the foot of the bed, back to the window, hands in his pockets, then out of his pockets. He'd loosened his tie in the car and pulled it off somewhere between the door and the minibar. His jacket was over the back of a chair. He had the look of a man whose thoughts were moving faster than he wanted them to. Imani watched him in the mirror. "Julian?" Her voice was even, quiet. He stopped. "Yeah?" "What were you and your mother talking about tonight, at the window?" A pause, small but real. "Her nerves," he said. He moved toward the bed and sat on the edge of it, rubbing the back of his neck. "Dom blindsided everyone, Imani. You have to understand how that landed for her." "For her?" "For all of us." He looked up, and his expression was soft now, the charm sliding back into place like a key turning. "You could have told me. I understand why you didn't, I do, but I'm your husband. I found out at my own wedding." Imani slipped the last button free and let the dress drop from her shoulders. She caught it before it hit the floor, laid it carefully over the vanity chair. She pulled on the hotel robe without hurry. "I heard you," she said. "That's not what I asked." Julian let out a breath. She was upset. She felt blindsided. I was calming her down. He stood and crossed the room toward her, his hands finding her waist. "It was nothing. She was embarrassed. You know how she is." He pressed his forehead gently to her temple. He smelled like expensive cologne and champagne, and something underneath both of those things that she couldn't name. "Tonight was supposed to be about us," he murmured. She let him hold her for a moment. She kept her eyes open. He was asleep before midnight. She lay beside him in the dark and listened to his breathing slow and even out, watched the ceiling, and waited. The city outside was a low and distant hum. The champagne was still on the console table. She hadn't touched it. When she was certain, she moved. Julian's laptop was on the desk near the window, sitting half open where he'd left it. He hadn't closed it all the way. The screen was still faintly lit, not locked. She sat down in front of it. The chair didn't make a sound. She moved the cursor. The screen came to life. His email was open. She wasn't looking for anything specific, not yet. She was simply looking, the way you look when your stomach is already telling you something your brain hasn't caught up to. She found it in a folder labeled simply, F Matters. Tucked beneath some investment statements and a few property documents, there was a scanned notice, official letterhead, a bank's name across the top. Her eyes moved down the page slowly, taking it in piece by piece. A defaulted loan. The collateral listed was the Ashworth family estate, the house in Myers Park that Vivian treated like a birthright, the one with the formal garden and the iron gate and the portraits in the hallway. The default notice was dated 8 months ago. She sat with that for a moment. Then she opened the next document. It was a draft email, unfinished, unsent, addressed to a lawyer she didn't recognize, a name she'd never heard Julian mention. The subject line read, Re-Marital Asset Structuring, Ashworth. The body of the email was 3 paragraphs. She read it twice. The date in the top corner was 6 weeks before the wedding. She closed the laptop. She placed her hands flat on the desk and looked at them. The room was very quiet. The city hummed on outside, indifferent. Then, from somewhere in the back of her mind, the way his voice always came, not in a rush, but in a drift, like a door opening onto something steady, she heard Eli. Not his words at her graduation, something later, something smaller and harder. She'd been sitting beside his hospital bed, the room smelling of antiseptic and old flowers, and he'd taken her hand in both of his grip still surprisingly firm for a man that thin. He'd looked at her directly, the way he always did when something mattered. "Promise me," he'd said. family included. You don't show anyone the full picture until you've seen what kind of people they really are. Not until then. She had promised. She sat in the dark hotel room and thought about that promise. She thought about what she had just read. She thought about Julian sleeping 10 feet away, breathing steadily, one arm over the pillow where she'd been lying. She didn't cry. She didn't move for a long time. The bathroom light was harsh after the dark of the bedroom. She ran cold water over her wrists and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. No expression she could name, just her own face, steady and awake. Then she picked up her phone. She opened her messages and typed to her assistant, Marcus, a man she trusted completely and paid well to deserve it. Need a full financial picture on Ashworth Holdings and all related entities. Discreet. Personal communications for Julian Ashworth, too. Whatever's accessible. Start this morning. She read it back once, then sent it. She set the phone face down on the marble counter. Through the wall, she could hear Julian shifting in his sleep. She washed her face, dried it, and walked back out into the bedroom. She lay down beside him. She pulled the covers up. She closed her eyes. When he reached for her in his sleep, his hand finding her arm out of habit, she didn't pull away. She let him hold on. And she stared at the ceiling, very still, and waited for morning. Breakfast came up on a room service cart at 8:30. Eggs, fruit, coffee, orange juice in a small glass carafe. Julian had ordered it while she was in the shower, and he was already dressed when she came out, sitting at the small table by the window in a crisp shirt, the city bright behind him, looking relaxed and rested and handsome in the uncomplicated way he always did. "Morning," he said and smiled at her. "Morning." She sat across from him and reached for the coffee. He talked about the honeymoon flight time. He talked about whether she'd be warm enough in the evenings and whether she'd packed the sandals she liked. He talked easily, his fork moving, his eyes on her with that open and comfortable look that had made her fall for him in the first place. She listened. She responded. She laughed once at something he said about the in-flight movie options. She was very good at this. She had always been very good at this. And in the pocket of her robe, her phone sat quietly, its screen dark, its message already sent. The office had no sign on the door. That was intentional. Suite 1140 at the Hartwell Tower downtown was listed under a Shell LLC that most people had never heard of, and the few who had wouldn't connect it to Amani Carter, art teacher, wife of Julian Ashworth, resident of a tasteful brownstone in Dilworth. Julian knew she sometimes came here. She'd described it once as a co-working space she rented for grading papers when the apartment felt too small. He'd nodded and never asked again. That was one of the things she'd once found easy about him. She arrived at 10 in the morning, dressed the way she always dressed for the office, plain dark slacks, a simple blouse, nothing that would catch the eye. She badged through the private elevator with her palm and took it to the 11th floor, where Marcus was already waiting. He had everything laid out. Marcus Webb was 31, methodical and entirely unimpressed by money, which was one reason she'd hired him. He set up his materials the way a doctor sets up before delivering news he's rehearsed. Organized, quiet, no drama in the presentation itself, all the drama in the content. He'd printed everything, old habit and a useful one. Paper left no trail in a server. "Walk me through it," Amani said. She sat across from him at the long table, hands folded in front of her, and she listened. It took 20 minutes. Ashworth Holdings, which the family presented publicly as a portfolio of commercial real estate and legacy investments, had been running on fumes for years. The actual picture, once Marcus had peeled back the surface, was a stack of refinanced loans, deferred interest, and one commercial property in Southend that was technically still producing income, but was locked in a lease dispute that would likely end badly. The estate in Myers Park, the house with the iron gate and the formal garden, the one Vivian treated like it had been handed down from God himself, was mortgaged to its absolute limit. Not once, 3 separate instruments layered on top of each other over the course of 8 years. The most recent one, Marcus said, setting a page in front of her, is 32 months old. That's when the second refinance maxed out. They've been servicing the interest, but just barely. Imani looked at the number. She didn't react. And the company? She asked. 2 payrolls. He said it plainly, like a man reading a weather report. Maybe 3, if they defer the vendor invoices that are already past due. There's no reserve, no line of credit they haven't already drawn on. Someone's been moving small amounts between accounts to make the balances look cleaner than they are, but it's cosmetic. She turned to the next page she'd prepared, Julian's personal financials. His allowance from the family trust, she said. Cut off. Marcus tapped the line. 4 months before the wedding. The trust ran dry. There's one final transfer here, he pointed, and then nothing. Flat zero from that source. 4 months before the wedding. She and Julian had been together for 2 years before they married. 4 months before the wedding, she'd been planning centerpieces and tasting cake samples and picking out a dress. Julian had taken her to dinner twice that week. He'd seemed fine, happy even. He'd never said a word. She set that page down and moved to the next. The last section was the one that took the air out of the room. Marcus had pulled together a timeline, emails, calendar entries, a few forwarded messages recovered through Hartwell's legal access to third-party records. They painted a picture she'd been trying not to fully imagine since the night in the hotel. Julian had mentioned Imani to his mother 14 months ago. A throwaway comment in an email. Met someone interesting, school teacher, no pretensions, doesn't ask about money. Vivian's reply had come back in under 3 hours. It was warm, in a way that Vivian, in Imani's experience, very rarely was. After that, the correspondence between Julian and his mother changed, less casual, more frequent. Vivian had begun asking pointed questions about Imani's background, her family, whether she had any financial assets of her own. Julian had answered each one. Imani read those answers slowly. He'd told his mother she seemed to have quiet money, that she never discussed it but had a quality about her, that she lived simply but well, that she never looked at price tags. He wasn't wrong. She didn't. She'd trained herself not to. Vivian's reply to that particular email was 3 lines long. Push it forward. Don't wait. She's exactly what we need right now. Imani set the page down on the table. She sat with it. There was a difference, she thought, between being loved and being selected. She'd felt chosen. She'd believed that. She'd let herself believe it because she'd wanted to, because Julian was warm and easy, and she'd been careful her whole life, and she thought, finally, she'd been careful enough. She hadn't been choosing. She'd been chosen, the way you choose a tool because it fits the job. Keep going, she said. Marcus looked up from his folder. Julian's personal accounts, direct communications. I want anything tied to unexplained charges, recurring contacts, anything that doesn't fit the pattern of a man planning a wedding. She kept her voice level. Anything from the 8 months before we married. Understood. He made a note. I'll have it within the week. She nodded. Good. She closed her copy of the audit file. She gathered her things without rushing, capped her pen, slid the pages into the leather folder she'd brought, and stood. By 6 o'clock, she was home. Julian was in the kitchen when she walked in, standing at the stove, a dish towel over his shoulder, something with garlic already fragrant in the pan. He turned when he heard the door and smiled, that easy, open smile, the one that had made her say yes. Perfect timing, he said. 10 more minutes. She set her bag down by the door. She smiled back at him. Smells good, she said, and she walked into the kitchen, and she sat at the island, and she asked him about his day. She heard him before she saw him. Julian's voice carried through the front hallway, low and easy, the way it got when he was talking to family. Comfortable, unhurried. Imani set her keys on the hook by the door and listened for a moment before stepping further inside. It's fine, Patrice. I'm not saying that. A pause. Okay, yeah, that's fine. She walked into the living room. He was on the couch, one ankle crossed over his knee, the phone pressed to his ear. He looked up at her and smiled, mouthed "Patrice," and rolled his eyes a little, the way he always did. The small performance of a man pretending his sister exhausted him. She smiled back and went to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water. She didn't leave the room. "Tell her it's casual," Julian said. "No big thing, just the cookout." Another pause, shorter this time. "Yeah, Brooke's fine. Imani won't mind." She set her glass down quietly on the counter. Brooke. She knew the name. Julian had mentioned her exactly once, early in their relationship, the way people mention old things they consider settled. "My ex. We ended things years ago. Totally fine now." She hadn't pressed. She hadn't needed to. There had been no reason. She picked her glass back up and took a slow sip. He wrapped up the call a few minutes later and came into the kitchen, already explaining before she could ask anything. "That was Patrice," he said. "She's doing a cookout at her place next weekend.
Wants to have some people over. Keep things light."
He opened the fridge and reached past her for a bottle of water. "She invited Brooke Sinclair. You remember I mentioned her? Old friend of the family. Patrice's idea, just to keep the gathering casual." "That's nice," Imani said. Julian looked at her. "You're okay with it?" She turned to face him fully, kept her voice easy, her expression open. "Why wouldn't I be?" He relaxed. "I just wanted to make sure." "It's a cookout, Julian." She set her glass in the sink. "Tell Patrice I'll bring something." He smiled, kissed her temple, and that was the end of it. She lay awake that night long after Julian fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood outside. It wasn't the name itself, it was the ease. The way he'd said, "Imani won't mind," before he'd said a single word to her. The way Patrice had arranged it, and he'd agreed without any visible hesitation. The way the whole thing had the feel of something that had already been discussed at length, somewhere she hadn't been. She made a note of it, filed it, the way she filed everything now. Marcus called 4 days later, just before noon. She stepped out of the Hartwell office and took the call, standing at the window, 11 floors up, watching the city below. "Tell me," she said. He had flagged something in Julian's phone records, a pattern that had shown up while combing through the 8 months before the wedding, as she'd asked. Late-night calls to a number that wasn't saved under any name in his phone. Not frequent, not obvious, but consistent, spaced out in a way that looked deliberate rather than accidental. "How late?" she asked. "Between 11 and 1, mostly. 10 calls over 6 months. He paused. "There's also a hotel charge, about 3 weeks before the wedding. 1 night, weeknight, downtown. He used a secondary card, not the one tied to your joint account." She said nothing. "I cross-referenced the unlisted number," Marcus continued. "It's registered to a Brooke Sinclair. The hotel has her listed as the second guest on the reservation." She kept her eyes on the street below. A delivery truck idled at the corner. A woman walked a dog past it without looking up. 3 weeks before the wedding," she said. "Yes." She stayed quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had nothing to do with not knowing what to say. The financial betrayal had been brutal. She'd absorbed it, processed it, set it aside to be dealt with on her terms. But this was different. This wasn't his mother's scheming or the family's desperation dressed up as love. This was Julian, alone, making a choice, making it more than once, making it right up until the day he stood at the altar and said the words she'd believed. "Document everything," she said. "Dates, times, the card number, the reservation, all of it." "Already done." "Good." She exhaled, slow and even. "Thank you, Marcus." She ended the call and stood at the window a moment longer. Then she went back to her desk. She waited until Julian was asleep before she called Dominique. It was almost 11. Dominique picked up on the second ring, the way she always did when Imani called late. No questions about the hour, no theatrics, just, I'm here. He's been seeing her, Imani said. Brooke, since before the wedding. His family knows, probably encouraged it. A long pause, then Dominique said, quietly, Imani. I'm okay. I know you are, but you can say it. I just did. She shifted, leaned her head back against the headboard. I need to keep gathering everything before I move. I'm not ready yet, but I needed you to know. Okay, Dominique said. Then let's think. And they did. The restaurant Vivian chose was the kind of place where the menus had no prices. It sat on the east side of Charlotte, tucked between a private members club and a jeweler that didn't display anything in the window. The dining room was all pale linen and low voices and women who looked at each other's handbags before their faces. Imani arrived 2 minutes early. Vivian arrived 5 minutes late. She came through the door in a cream blazer, a string of real pearls, and a smile that looked like it had been ironed on that morning. She kissed the air near Imani's cheek and sat down as though the table had been waiting specifically for her. You look rested, Vivian said. Marriage must be agreeing with you. It is, Imani said. Thank you for suggesting this. The server came. Vivian ordered without looking at the menu. Imani ordered water and the salmon, and watched Vivian arrange her napkin across her lap with the careful precision of a woman who had practiced appearing effortless for a very long time. I thought we should do this sooner, Vivian said. Clear the air. Wedding weeks are always so hectic, there's never time to actually connect. There really isn't, Imani agreed. I also wanted to go over the gift registry. Some of the responses came back to me by mistake. The Whitmore family sent their card to the house instead of to you, and the Delaney's. She opened her clutch and produced a small, folded envelope. I didn't open anything, of course. Imani took it. I appreciate that. Vivian smiled, reached for her water glass. They moved through the first half of the meal easily enough. Small talk about the honeymoon plans they hadn't made yet, about Charlotte in the summer, about a charity gala Vivian served on the committee for. Imani listened, asked the right questions, let Vivian talk. And Vivian, once she started, could not seem to stop. It began with the gala, the venue, the silent auction, a particular woman named Sandra Whitmore who had no taste but enough money to pretend otherwise. It moved to the country club's new membership process, which Vivian found embarrassing in its transparency. Then to a woman named Deirdre, who had apparently shown up to a luncheon last spring wearing something Vivian described only as a mistake. Each story was told with a light laugh and a lowered voice, the way women like Vivian always delivered their sharpest opinions, as if sharing a confidence. But somewhere around the third story, the laugh stopped reaching her eyes. It's just, Vivian paused, set her fork down. These women have known each other for 30 years. They notice everything. A smaller table at the gala, a club membership not renewed on time, a son who isn't moving in the right direction. She picked up her fork again. They don't say anything, of course. That's what makes it so suffocating. They simply know. Imani watched her. You have to understand, Vivian continued, what it means to maintain a certain standing. It isn't vanity, it's infrastructure. Everything the family has built depends on perception. The moment people stop believing in your place at the table, she stopped, caught herself, reached for her water again. Well, you understand. I do, Imani said. She meant it, and she didn't mean it at all. She understood the fear. She could see it now, clearly, beneath the pressed blazer and the perfect pearls. A woman who had spent 30 years terrified that the women around her were one wrong detail away from seeing the truth. That fear had curdled into cruelty the way untended things always did. It had turned outward, toward anyone who might reflect that diminishment back at her, anyone who looked too easy to dismiss, anyone like Imani. Vivian wasn't cruel because she was strong. She was cruel because she was scared. Imani understood that completely. She also understood it didn't change anything. She thought about Eli that evening, sitting in the quiet of the living room after Julian had gone to bed. She had been maybe 26. A buyer had approached Eli about a property he'd held for years, a plot of land outside the city that had tripled in value. The offer was real, the money was significant, and the buyer had made the mistake of telling Eli exactly what he planned to do with it, a development that would carry Eli's name on it, etched right into the signage. Eli had passed. He wanted my name more than my work, he'd told her afterward, sitting in his kitchen with a cup of coffee like it was nothing. That's a different transaction than the one he thought we were having. She remembered how certain he'd sounded, not defensive, not regretful, just settled. She had not fully understood it at 26, the way she understood it now. Vivian had spent her entire life terrified of losing her name, what it meant, what it bought her, how it looked to the Sandras and the Deirdres across the gala table, and that terror had made her smaller, had made her someone who would tear a woman apart at her own wedding reception just to feel taller. Eli had held his name like something private, something that didn't need an audience to stay real. She sat with that for a long time. Then she turned off the lamp and went to bed, and in the morning she drove to the office. The office was on the 14th floor of a glass building in uptown Charlotte. No sign on the door, no company name in the lobby directory, just a suite number and a keycard reader that only 12 people in the world had access to. Imani sat at the head of the conference table with 3 people across from her. Marcus Webb, her lead attorney, Diane Chu, her senior financial analyst, and a woman named Lori Taft, a specialist in real estate debt acquisitions, who had been quietly loyal to Hartwell Capital for 9 years. The table between them was covered in paper. Marcus slid a folder across to Imani. It was thin, navy blue cover, no label. "The note closed this morning," he said. "The bank accepted our offer. No conditions." Imani opened the folder. Inside was a single-page summary and a transfer confirmation. The defaulted loan tied to the Ashworth family estate, the one securing almost all of Ashworth Holdings' remaining collateral, now belonged to a Hartwell subsidiary called Meridian Property Group. Meridian had no public link to Imani's name, no link to Hartwell Capital either, not on the surface. It was a clean acquisition, quiet, airtight. She read the summary once, then closed the folder. "What's the outstanding balance?" $4.3 million, Lori said. The bank had been carrying it as a problem asset for 14 months. They were happy to be rid of it. "And the estate itself?" "Appraised at 6.1 last year. The family's been bleeding equity for a long time. There's not much cushion left." Imani set the folder on the stack to her left. "The post-nuptial agreement," she said. Diane opened a second folder. This one was thicker. "Julian's cloud account. His lawyer drafted it 8 days after the wedding." She slid a printed copy across. It was never filed, never signed, but it was saved. Imani looked at the document. It was 12 pages long, dense with legal language, but the core of it was simple enough. The agreement would have reclassified a portion of Imani's private holdings as joint marital assets, based on a broad definition of shared investment interests developed during the marriage. The language was careful, technical, written by someone who knew exactly what they were trying to do. 8 days after the wedding. She had been picking out curtains for their bedroom. 8 days after the wedding. She turned to the last page. The signature line was blank. Julian's name was printed beneath it in clean, standard font. There was a second line beside it. Her name. She closed the document, put it on the stack. "Any questions about provenance?" Marcus asked. "If he challenges how we obtained it, his account was backed up to a shared cloud service tied to the email address he used on our joint Netflix login," Imani said. "He gave me the password himself." Marcus nodded slowly.
"Then it's solid." No one said anything for a moment. Diane shuffled a third set of papers. Julian's financial records, the hotel charge, the phone logs cross-referencing Brooke's number, 3 months of account activity that painted a picture no one in Julian's family would be able to argue with. Each page was clear, labeled, dated, the kind of document that left no room for a different interpretation. Imani gathered the 3 folders into a single organized stack and handed them to Marcus. "I want 3 sets of copies," she said. Physical only, nothing sent digitally. Done by tomorrow afternoon. Good. Dominique had handled the dinner invitation the way she handled everything, efficiently and without drama. She'd called Vivian herself, using the kind of warm, easy tone that made people feel like an idea had been their own. A reconciliation dinner, something intimate, a chance for the family to come together after the chaos of the reception, to start fresh. Vivian had agreed within minutes. Patrice, Dominique told Imani later, had needed a little more convincing. She kept saying it felt rushed, Dominique said, laughing on the phone that night. I told her that healing takes courage. She almost believed me. Did Julian say anything? Imani asked. Julian agreed the second his mother did. You know how he is. She did. At home that week, Julian had been careful, attentive in the way people get when they can feel something is wrong but can't name it. He brought her coffee in the mornings without being asked about her day, touched her shoulder when he passed her in the kitchen. She accepted all of it without comment. She kept her voice easy, her expression calm. She laughed at the right moments and let him think it was working. At night, when he slept, she lay still and stared at the ceiling. The night before the dinner, Imani sat at the small desk in the study. Julian had gone to bed an hour ago. The 3 folders were arranged in front of her: the loan documents, the post-nup draft, Julian's financial records. She went through them one final time, page by page, not searching for anything new. She already knew what was there. She just needed to sit with it, all of it, in one place before tomorrow. The loan note, the post-nup, unsigned but saved, the hotel charge with Brooke's name threaded through it like a splinter. She closed the last folder. She stacked all 3 together, lined up the edges, and set them back down in the center of the desk. The Ashworth Estate dining room smelled like candle wax and old wood. A long mahogany table ran the center of the room, set with china that Imani suspected had not been used in months. Crystal glasses, pressed linen napkins. Vivian had gone to the trouble of making everything look exactly right. She always did. The 4 of them sat in the amber light of the chandelier, Vivian at the head, Patrice to her left, Julian beside Imani on the right. A housekeeper had brought out the first course, a butternut squash soup, perfectly smooth, served in wide, shallow bowls, and for a while the only sounds were spoons and soft conversation and the low, careful music of people pretending everything was fine. Vivian had done most of the talking. The wedding florist, a friend's daughter who had just gotten engaged, a charity luncheon she was planning for March. She moved from topic to topic like someone navigating a room full of furniture in the dark, careful, practiced, never stopping long enough to bump into anything real. Patrice watched Imani from across the table, not hostile exactly, watchful. She'd barely touched her soup. Julian refilled Imani's water glass without being asked. Imani let him. They were halfway through the main course, roasted chicken, green beans, the kind of meal that looked elegant without requiring too much, when Imani set down her fork. She did it quietly, no announcement. She simply placed the fork on the edge of her plate, straightened in her chair, and reached for the leather portfolio she had rested against the leg of her seat when she sat down. She set it on the table. Vivian's eyes dropped to it for just a second, then back up. I wanted to wait until we'd had a chance to settle in, Imani said. Her voice was even, unhurried. Before we talked about some things that affect everyone in this room. Julian went very still. Imani opened the portfolio and slid the first document toward the center of the table. It was the loan summary. One clean page, the transfer confirmation clipped behind it. 4 weeks ago, she said, a real estate holding company called Meridian Property Group
purchase the defaulted loan note on this estate from the bank that had been carrying it. She let that sit for one breath. Meridian is a Hartwell subsidiary. The note is mine. The silence that followed was different from the silence before, heavier. Vivian's hand, resting beside her water glass, did not move. That means the mortgage on this property, Imani continued, and the collateral it secures for Ashworth Holdings falls under my control. What happens next, the terms, the timeline, is entirely my decision. Patrice set her fork down. What is this? Imani didn't look at her yet. Julian. She turned to her husband. He was staring at the document like it had appeared out of nowhere, like gravity had shifted and he hadn't caught up yet. I'd like you to explain something to your mother. She reached into the portfolio and placed the second document on the table, the post-nuptial agreement, 12 pages neatly clipped. She turned it so the signature page faced up, both blank lines visible, her name printed beneath one of them. Julian's jaw worked. Nothing came out. It was drafted 8 days after our wedding, Imani said, still looking at him. By your attorney. It was never filed, but it was saved. She paused. Would you like to explain what it was for, or should I? Imani. His voice came out thin. That's not... It wasn't finalized. It doesn't mean... It means someone was thinking about my assets before the ink on our marriage license was dry. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she turned to Vivian. Vivian's face had changed. The composure was still there, technically, but it had gone rigid, like porcelain under pressure. I'm not finished, Imani said. She reached into the portfolio one last time. Julian's financial records, the phone logs, the hotel charge highlighted in yellow. She placed the page in front of Vivian without ceremony. Brooke Sinclair, Imani said. Julian's phone records show regular contact with her number beginning 3 months before our wedding. This charge, she touched the highlighted line, is a hotel on Moorhead Street, 3 weeks before the ceremony. The room didn't just go quiet. It contracted. Patrice's chair scraped back an inch. You went through his private... He used our shared cloud login, Imani said simply. He gave me the password. This is a manipulation. Patrice's voice had an edge now, sharp and rising. You set this whole dinner up to humiliate us. You planned this. Imani looked at her then, calm, straight, without blinking. I planned to understand who I married, she said. That's all. She tapped the documents in sequence, the loan note, the post-nup, the financial records. Everything on this table is documented, dated, verified. If anyone in this room would like to dispute something specific, I'm happy to listen. Nobody spoke. Julian sat frozen between his mother and his wife, his hands flat on the table, looking at nothing. Vivian's face, for the first time since Imani had known her, held no performance at all, just a woman staring at the end of something she had built her entire life to protect. Imani closed the portfolio. She folded her napkin and set it on the table beside her plate. She pushed her chair back and stood. I'll be in touch about next steps, she said. She picked up her bag. She picked up the portfolio, and she walked out of the dining room, through the front hall, and out the door of the estate, alone, into the cool Charlotte night. The law offices of Hargrove and Finch sat on the 14th floor of a glass tower downtown, with a view of the city that stretched all the way to the tree line. Imani had been coming here for 6 years. She knew which chair the morning light hit first. She always took it. Marcus Hargrove sat across from her, a yellow legal pad in front of him and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. He was a careful man, methodical. She had chosen him specifically for that. You want to call the note, he said. In full. She set her copy of the loan summary on the desk between them. No renegotiation, no payment plan, no extended timeline beyond what the original terms require. Marcus made a note. That'll trigger the foreclosure process on the estate. I know. Vivian Ashworth will lose the property. She borrowed against it, Imani said. I didn't make that decision for her. He looked at her over the rim of his glasses, not judging, just checking. It was something she appreciated about him. All right, he said. He made another note. And the divorce filing? Today. She slid the second folder across the desk. The prenuptial agreement is in there. Section 4, subsection C. Julian signed it 14 months ago. She paused. I don't think he read it very carefully. Marcus opened the folder. He scanned the page, and something almost like a smile passed across his face before his expression settled back to neutral. The prenuptial agreement was airtight. It had taken 3 months and 2 separate attorneys to draft. It protected Hartwell Capital, her personal accounts, and any assets held under the blind trust in their entirety. Julian would leave the marriage exactly as he had entered it, with his name, his charm, and nothing of hers. I'll have the filing submitted before noon, Marcus said. Imani nodded. She picked up her coffee. Outside the window, the city moved the way it always did, without waiting for anyone. Word traveled fast when it needed to. By Thursday of that same week, Patrice Ashworth Cole received a letter from her employer's Human Resources Department. The language was formal and bloodless. Conflict of interest review, organizational restructuring, effective immediately. The company's parent holding group had recently come under new partial ownership through an acquisition. Standard due diligence had flagged her position as a liability, given her family's direct financial entanglements with the acquiring firm. It was not personal. The letter said so clearly. It was simply policy. Imani was in her penthouse kitchen that same evening, still in her work clothes with her shoes off, when the front desk called up. Ms. Carter, there's a Mr. Ashworth in the lobby. He says it's urgent. She set down her glass. Send him up. She had time to put her shoes back on before the elevator opened. Julian stepped into the foyer and stopped. His eyes moved across the room, the high ceilings, the city skyline filling every window, the quiet evidence of a life he had never been invited into. She watched him take it in, watched something complicated move across his face. You never told me, he said. No, she agreed. I didn't. He stepped forward. His voice shifted into the register she recognized, warm, slightly wounded, calibrated to make her feel responsible for his pain. Imani, whatever you think happened, whatever your people found, you have to let me explain. We just got married. We can fix this, whatever it takes. She said nothing. My mother made mistakes, he said. Patrice was out of line at the wedding, I know that. But you can't blow up an entire family over one bad night. That's not who you are. She looked at him. He was still handsome, still poised, still reaching for the version of her he thought he understood. The quiet teacher, the patient woman who would soften if he pressed the right places. Julian? Her voice was steady. Your family didn't have one bad night. You drafted a document to access my assets 8 days after our wedding. That was my lawyer being overly cautious. You were with Brooke 3 weeks before the ceremony. His jaw tightened. For a moment the charm slipped, and underneath it was something colder. So that's it? His voice sharpened. You made up your mind and now we're done? You don't even want to try? Imani was quiet for a moment. She thought of Eli. Not his face, not a specific memory, just his voice, low and certain, the way it had always been. You don't owe anybody an explanation for protecting what you built. She didn't. I would have given you everything, she said. Her voice didn't waver. Freely, openly, all of it. If you had ever just asked for me, instead of my money. She looked at him. You never did. Julian opened his mouth, closed it. There was nothing left in the room that worked in his favor. No angle, no lever, no version of himself that could reach her now. Imani walked to the front door and opened it.
She didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. She simply stood there, one hand resting on the door, and waited. The gallery smelled like fresh paint and cedar wood. Imani stood near the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived, wearing a deep green dress that she had picked herself. Not because a stylist told her it photographed well, but because Eli had always said green suited her. The room behind her hummed with voices. Children's paintings covered every wall in bright, generous strokes. Abstract suns, lopsided horses, whole worlds made from tempera paint and imagination. The Elijah Hartwell Foundation gallery opening had sold out 3 weeks in advance. Dominique appeared at her shoulder with 2 glasses of sparkling water and a look that said she had been watching Imani work the room for the last 40 minutes. "You need to eat something," she said, handing over a glass. "I ate." "A piece of bread doesn't count." Imani smiled. She took the glass and let her eyes move across the room. Journalists, donors, Charlotte's school superintendents, parents who had driven across town in second-hand cars because their kids' drawings were hanging on these walls tonight, framed like masterpieces, which was exactly what they were. "He would have loved this," Imani said. Dominique followed her gaze. "Yeah," she said softly. "He would have." They stood together for a moment without speaking. 6 months had passed since the dinner at the Ashworth estate, 4 months since the divorce was finalized. The papers had come through on a Tuesday. Imani had signed them at her kitchen table, alone, with a cup of tea going cold beside her, and then she had gone to work. There had been no ceremony in the grief of it, just a door, closing quietly. "Hartwell Capital on the front page," Dominique said, nodding toward a framed copy of a financial magazine displayed near the gallery entrance. It was last month's issue. Imani's name in the headline, her photo beside it. No blind trust, no initials, her full name. Imani Carter, founder and CEO, Hartwell Capital. "Took long enough," Dominique said. "It took exactly as long as it needed to," Imani said. Dominique gave her a sideways look. "You sound like Eli." "Good." Across the room, a girl no older than 9 was standing in front of one of the larger paintings, a sweeping mess of orange and gold that took up most of the wall, staring at it with her arms crossed and her head tilted slightly to one side, studying it, the way Imani used to study things, like there was a secret inside and patience was the only way to find it. Imani watched her for a moment. "For kids like you used to be," Eli had said toward the end, when she had told him her plan. His voice had been thin by then, but his eyes were the same. She had kept that promise. Julian Ashworth rented a 1-bedroom apartment in a part of Charlotte he had never bothered to learn the name of before. The building had a gym on the 2nd floor that was always too warm and a parking lot that flooded when it rained. He worked in client intake at a mid-sized insurance firm. The salary was modest, the hours were regular. His co-workers were polite and largely uninterested in where he had come from. Brooke came by on weekends sometimes. They would order food and watch television and not say much. She had taken a contract position at a marketing agency downtown. It paid the bills. They were not unhappy in any dramatic way. They were simply 2 people in a small apartment doing the ordinary work of ordinary days, moving through a life that had turned out to be much smaller than either of them had once imagined it would be. The Ashworth estate had sold at auction. Vivian was living with a cousin in Raleigh. She had declined to speak to Julian since January, and he had stopped calling in February. Patrice had relocated to Atlanta. She had found work, eventually. She did not talk about the family anymore. She had started introducing herself using her married name only. Back in the gallery, a local news anchor caught Imani near the back hallway and asked if she had a moment for a quick comment. "Of course," she said. The anchor smiled into her camera and turned to Imani. "Ms. Carter, you've made headlines twice this year. Once when your identity as Hartwell's founder went public, and now tonight with this foundation launch. How does it feel to finally be doing all of this openly, under your own name?" Imani thought about it, not for long. "It feels honest," she said.
That's the part that matters most to me. Not the headlines. Just honest. The anchor nodded and thanked her, and the camera moved on. Dominique reappeared beside her. Well said. I meant it. I know you did. Dominique bumped her shoulder gently. Eli knew you would. Imani looked out across the room. The 9-year-old was still standing in front of the orange and gold painting. A woman beside her, her mother probably, was pointing at something in the upper left corner, and the girl was nodding slowly, seeing whatever it was now, recognition lighting her face. Imani felt the fullness of the room settle around her. All these people who knew her name, her real name, every part of it. And she smiled. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. I've got 2 stories on the screen that you have to watch next. Have a great day!